Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Board of Adjustment meeting for December 5th, 2019, which is now called to order. We ask that you silence your cell phones if you have not done so already. If you are not the applicant and you wish to speak on a matter, we ask that you fill out one of these white forms that are available in the hall. We ask that you limit your comments to 5 minutes, and please not interrupt the board member while they're speaking. First item on the agenda is to receive the minutes from the November 7th meeting. Do we have a motion or any changes?
Motion to receive minutes.
Second.
A motion and a second to approve the minutes from the November 7th meeting. Cast your votes, please. Okay. Yeah, and one abstention. And the motion's approved. And I do want to welcome our new board member who's been on the board several times before, Mike Voorhees, and we appreciate your service to the board. The next item on the agenda is continuance requests or withdrawals. Do we have any?
We have 4 today. Item 1, case 14-663, defer to February 6th. Item 11, case 14-695 to January 16th. Item 13, case 14-686 and 87 to January 16th. And item 14, case 14-669 has been withdrawn.
Do we have a motion to approve the continuances as requested?
Motion.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to approve the continuances as requested. Cast your votes, please.
I have to abstain on number 1 on that, but I vote yes on the rest of them.
Okay. Is that adequate for the record? Okay. And the motion's approved. There are no matters on the consent docket, so we'll move to items requiring a separate vote.
First item is number 2, case 14-672, application for special exception of Carolyn Road to allow a manufactured home to serve as a temporary second dwelling to relieve a medical hardship at 14320 South Meridian.
The applicant present.
Good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Roden, and I reside at 13605 South Drexel Avenue in Oklahoma City, where I have lived with my husband, Frank, until he passed away in October. I'm here today to ask you to grant a variance to allow me to place the mobile home on property that I own at 14320 South Meridian in Oklahoma City. This is 1 acre, which is zoned I-2. Is part of 80 acres my grandparents purchased in 1919. There is a small 2-bedroom house, probably 900 square feet on this acre, where my daughter resides and where my parents lived before her. We started this process in September as I needed help in caring for my husband due to his many health problems, and also needed help for myself required in daily living. By placing the mobile home next to my daughter's house, she would be able to help me around the clock. But Frank passed away in October before we could attend the November meeting to present our case. At 83, I now find myself living alone and requiring help with daily life. As I try to adjust to life without my husband, it would be a great benefit to have help immediately from my daughter by her living next door to me. It is for this reason that I ask you to grant the variance to place the mobile home at 14320 South Meridian. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my case today, and I sincerely hope you will give me the variance.
Okay, we appreciate your comments, and sorry about your loss. I think it presents a pretty good case for a special exception. Were you thinking, I think the statutory maximum is 3 years. Were you thinking 3 years or a shorter amount of time?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
It's the statutory maximum is 3 years for a special exception like this. Were you requesting the full 3 years?
Yes.
Okay. Board members, any questions?
Is there any protest?
Was anyone here to speak on this matter other than the applicant?
I move approval 3 years.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to approve a special exception in case number 14672 for the reason that it meets the statutory conditions for a special exception. Cast your votes, please. And it's approved.
Thank you very much.
Item 3, case number 14680, request of Phil Fitzgerald for a variance to the maximum display area for an accessory sign located at 4025 Northwest 63rd Street.
Hi, hello, my name is Phil Fitzgerald, 3900 North Santa Fe, Oklahoma City. Also have a few extra exhibits to pass out.
Thank you.
We were asking for a variance from the approval from the signage people disallowed this because they felt the water tower itself was the sign. So the water tower has been built and it's been a part of the construction documents for the building. And so when they went to get the sign permit to put these letters on the sign, the signage person said that it was the entire piece was a sign instead of the letters. And so we've been here before, and we've got several examples where we've done this here in Oklahoma City previously, and would ask for this approval of this variance.
Board members, any questions? I think it seems like a pretty good case for a variance. In this case, pretty unique situation, so I can support it.
I move approval.
Second.
A motion and a second to approve case number 14680 for the reason that it meets the statutory conditions for a variance. Cast your votes, please. And it's approved.
Thank you.
Item 4, case 14683, request of Mcbride Orthopedic Hospital for a variance to the maximum size of an accessory sign located at 9600 North Broadway Extension.
Hi, how are you? I'm Julie Muller. I'm from Mcbride Orthopedic Hospital. The sign in question would go on the east face of our building. And we were asking for the variance in order to place our name on that east face. That is an example. Our building is 3 stories high, so it's tall. I think the allowed space is 150. Ours extends, and so the issue is that ours stretches 367 feet, but because of the size of the building, the letters have to be obviously larger. And so we were asking if we would have that capability for our patients, visitors that are coming in from Oklahoma Avenue. So the street is approximately 500 feet plus away. So it's difficult for our clientele to really identify if they are at the right place. The only other identifier on the building says main entrance. So.
JJ, was this maybe just the area doesn't contemplate buildings of this size? I mean, is that?
Well, you have, the code allows for large campus-type buildings like this in the O2 district, like colleges, universities, hospitals, those kind of things, but the sign regs don't really coincide with that. They don't allow very much signage for something that huge. It's contemplated in the office district that it's a small office.
And that was kind of my thought. My only hesitation was the scope of the variance that we'd be granting. It is, it's a very large variance. I mean, over twice the size. And so maybe you could speak a little bit more on why a smaller variance is not appropriate, so 250 square feet or 300.
So the letters each, and we have a lot of letters in our name, so that's why it feels so much longer. We have not ever used Mcbride as a standalone. Our logo is Mcbride Orthopedic Hospital, our identification. So most of those are 39 3/4 inches as far as the letters. There are in the beginning of the M, the O, the H. Those are taller because it's a capital letter. But the building itself is 126,000 square feet. It's a large facility. So much like if you were to put our name, which is long, in small letters, it would be impossible to see from the street. And so in order to do it and to do it aesthetically, professionally, to have the look and the identification from the street for our patients, then that is the best proportionate, although it does seem larger. When you place it up there on the top of the third floor, it doesn't look as large.
Yeah, and I think I'd also have a bit more hesitation if it were on the east side facing the on the west side facing the highway. But this is going to be on the east side.
This is on the interior. If you've ever come off of Britain onto Oklahoma Avenue, it's kind of an obscure street, and the Thunder facility is over there, DLO, Mustang. And our facility, the back of our facility faces Broadway Extension, but the front faces Oklahoma Avenue. So that's where it's a little bit of a catch-22 because we've got people coming in, they're looking for that identifier. And it's difficult if it doesn't have any marking. All they see is main entrance if they are in the proper place. So that's what led us to this application.
Board members, any questions?
Is there any signs on the west side? Any current signs? On the east side, sorry, highway side.
Currently on the east side, there's only directional signage.
Okay. And what about by the?
I apologize. It does say main entrance, but that is on the portico on the end, and of course it says main entrance to what? But that's a very small area as far as the portico.
Anything on the highway side?
On the highway, there's the standard blue identifier that tells you to come off, but nothing. We have a monument sign right there at Oklahoma Avenue, but it's the monument then directs also because we have an emergency room. So it just basically helps you make the turn. But then they start coming up this longer road in a large campus.
Okay.
And then the only other consideration I kind of had was if it's granted, it's limited to as drafted. So I don't think this property is going to have a subsequent use, but if it did, the variance would carry with that, and they'd get this huge sign that might not be appropriate in that circumstance.
I understand.
I don't have anyone else signed to speak on this matter. We have any other comments or a motion?
I'll make a motion. Motion to approve case number 14683 for reasons that it meets statutory requirements for a variance.
Got a motion and a second to approve case number 14683 for the reason that it meets the statutory conditions for a variance. Cast your votes, please. And it's approved.
Thank you all very much.
Item 5, case number 14684, request of Arthur Job for a variance to a platted 110-foot and 140-foot front yard building setback located at 21300 Southeast 101st Place.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I like to let my builder speak because he's more knowledgeable in this than me.
Okay, the issue we had with it.
Sir, can I just get you to state your name and address for the record? Thanks.
James McLean.
Okay, and the address.
And
your address.
My address, 990414 South Highway 102,
Okay.
Wellston.
Thanks.
Okay, the reason why we're requesting this variance on this, we have two lots, two corner lots, cul-de-sac lots that he bought, and they're together. At 140 feet back is a ridge, and then it drops off sharply past that. If we can pull the house up to with a 40-foot build line off the utility easement, like the rest of the houses in the neighborhood, then we wouldn't be building on fill. As it is now, we'd be building on about 8 foot of fill dirt because it drops off. But since he bought both lots, and they fall within that 120 foot across, which they have for the city, then that's what we're requesting, that we can move it up.
Board members, any questions?
No, it seems to be straightforward to me.
I agree, and staff seems to agree as well. The favorable comment here is by combining the two lots into one building site, the required 120-foot lot width is met at the 40-foot RA zoning setback as requested. So, yeah, I can support it.
I'd like to make a motion that we approve.
Okay.
Okay, a motion and a second to approve case number 14684, the reason that it meets the statutory conditions for a variance. Cast your votes, please. And it's approved.
Thank you.
Item 6, case number 14689, request of Sean Copel for a variance to permit maneuvering in the street right-of-way, 401 Northwest 10th Street.
Board members, Troy Downing, RBA Architects, 14918 Hertz Quail Springs Parkway, here for the applicant. Asking for a variance for maneuvering right-of-way for a dumpster on this property. It's a zero lot line building, built back in the 30s, and it's really the only place to put the dumpster on the property. Here for any questions you may have.
There's a comment here about DDRC approving this contingent on the approval of the Board of Adjustment. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, this was, we went through the review committee for this area. They didn't have any problem with the dumpster, but just asked that we got the variance through this board.
Do you recall what hearing that was set for?
Don't have
what meeting
that
was?
in front of me, what hearing that was.
Was it in November or October?
Well, it was probably about 6 months ago.
Okay.
So it's been some time.
I searched the past few months to try to find it when that hearing was to see if this dumpster issue was discussed, and I couldn't find the hearing. So
Should have put the date on there, I'm sorry.
that's all right. You're saying 6 months ago. Was this issue discussed at the hearing, the dumpster issue?
It was brought up that we were going to be, that's where the only place to put this was, and they didn't have a problem with it.
Okay. I mean, I just have some hesitation because that's such a busy intersection, and it's growing and growing in that area, and traffic is already bad at that intersection. That was my only kind of hesitation. Not that it defeats the application, but I'm just hesitant in these cases. Board members, any questions or comments?
I do have some comments. Because the dumpster's not going to be there all day, every day, then it shouldn't be that big of a problem, even though the area is very congested and it's heavily traveled. So
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I
is
understand your
the
question.
dumpster is going to be there all day, every day?
Well, it'll be in an enclosure.
Oh, okay. Enclosed.
Yeah, it'll be there, but the pickup time will be
Oh,
once a week, twice a week?
yeah, that's what I'm
I
talking
believe
about.
it's going to be once a week, and my understanding was they were going to be scheduling it early in the morning for this site, is what was talked about.
So it really shouldn't interfere that much with the flow of traffic?
I don't believe so.
Yes.
I don't have anyone else signed up to speak. If we have no other comments, do we have a motion?
I would like to make a motion that we accept.
Second.
A motion and a second to approve case number 14689 for the reason that it meets the statutory conditions for a variance. Cast your votes, please. And it's approved.
Thank you.
Item 7, case 14690, request to permit a metal facade building and the use of gravel for parking at 6724 North Martin Luther King.
Good afternoon. Chad Mullen with Renaissance Architects, 11100 Stratford Drive, representing Millwood Public School District. We are seeking 2 items today. One would be the use of metal wall finishes on the new multi-sport facility located on the north side of the campus. The use of these metal wall finishes would be aesthetically consistent with the adjacent gymnasium field house. Like you can see by the rendering, we have a mixture of metal panel, architectural panel, and brick as well.
And then this one, the purpose is to be consistent with the surrounding buildings, is that
Yes.
correct? Yeah.
There's the existing field house just directly to the west of the proposed new multi-sport.
What's the temporary gravel all about?
In order to meet the required codes for fire access and fire apparatus access, we are proposing to use gravel temporarily to attain our CO, and then within a year, 2 years, pave the gravel surface permanently. Our budget is just really tight right now, very tight.
Yeah, that was my only kind of question to clarify is how long we needed if we were going to approve. It sounds like 2 years, maybe 3 years to be safe, or is 2 years sufficient?
I would say 3 years to be safe.
Okay.
The primary use of this is just for fire apparatus and life safety.
Board members, any questions or comments? I didn't have anyone else here to speak on this, but we have a motion.
I'll move to approve case number 14690 for the reasons that it meets statutory requirements for variance.
Is this the motion for the variance on the gravel for a period of 3 years?
No, yes, sir, sorry, and 3 years on the gravel.
Okay.
Second.
A motion and a second to approve case number 14690 for the reasons that both variances meet the conditions necessary for a variance, subject to a 3-year time limitation for the gravel service variance. Cast your votes, please. And it's approved.
Thank you.
Item 8, case 14691, request of Vanguard funding for a variance to the maximum size of a freestanding accessory sign at 3000 West Memorial Road.
Good afternoon, David Box, 522 Colcord Drive, here on behalf of the applicant. Tim Johnson and Mark Zitzow with Johnson & Associates are also here with me. This is a variance request for the square footage allowed under the C3 zoning district for a sign located there at May and Memorial and the Kilpatrick Turnpike. When you look at the zoning regs, what would be allowed would be a 200 square foot sign. We are in compliance with the height. We are in compliance with all other sign requirements. The problem we have is the sign code doesn't reflect a change in how much property you might have or how big a development may be. If this was a single-use retail building, the same square footage would apply. Instead, as you can see in the picture there, we have well over 200,000 square feet of leasable space. Additionally, when you think of the rate at which traffic is flowing along Memorial as well as the turnpike, they're moving at a very high rate of speed. And so the larger the sign, the better image that will be able to be displayed, and the better image that can be displayed allows the traveling public to see it in advance time and make the necessary exit on the Kilpatrick Turnpike. Additionally, the turnpike right there, if you're familiar with this area, is actually sunken and goes down below May. May traverses over it. And so we have various images within your packet that I hope you've had a chance to review where you can see why from various points east and west we believe that we have met the justifications required. Cindy, if you could turn that one. Required for a variance. We believe the hardship we have is that the sign code would not allow for a signage that is adequate to display the size of a shopping center that we have here. Additionally, when you are driving up and down the turnpike there, you will notice multiple other signs at the same height as well as the same square footage that exists. So we believe that there would be no detriment to the public, and it's least necessary in that we meet all other conditions required under the C3 signage regulation. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
So we've had a few applications along the Kirkpatrick, and I always have hesitation on them, at least on the justification that the construction of the turnpike changed, and this is after the code, these code provisions, and so now that essentially creates a hardship for all the properties along the way. So I have some hesitation there, because if that's the case, then they just need to change the code. I mean, and I think it would go to not being a particular, peculiarity with this particular property. It's all properties along Kilpatrick. So I don't know that I want to support it on that basis. I could, however, support it just based on the size of the project.
That's what I would say, is that the hardship is really that we could have a 500 square foot retail establishment that would be allowed for the same amount of square footage, and yet we have over 200,000 square feet of leasable space. There's a flaw in the code in that it doesn't examine, similar to the Mcbride, it doesn't examine the scale and intensity of the use. It's simply C3 equals whatever the square footage is.
Board members, any questions or comments? Anyone else signed up to speak on this application?
I'll move approval. Second.
A motion and a second to approve case number 14691 for the reason that it meets the statutory conditions for a variance. Cast your votes, please. And it's
Thank you.
approved. Thanks.
Item 9, case 14693, request of Vintage Custom Homes for a variance to the lot width of the R1 Single Family District located at 10021 Southwest 21st Street.
Kirby Mongold, 6600 Southeast 162nd, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. We're requesting a variance at 10,021 Southwest 21st. We own the house next door, which is 10,025 Southwest 21st. As you can tell from the image up there, it was built over the property line based on surveying errors. So when we own the lot next door, which you can tell is actually, it's a pie-shaped lot, so it gets bigger there in the cul-de-sac, but the city requirements require that you have at the building line 50-foot right-of-way, or easement at the front of the house of the lot next door, which is 10,021. So we're proposing that we get an easement so we can give more property to 10,025 Southwest 21st, so they can still have two separate lots. And at 10,021, we'll set the house back far enough where it meets the requirement to have 50-foot frontage of the front building line.
So this
And I actually have a drawing in there of what 10,021 would look like with the house sitting back farther.
This building's already constructed, but
The one right there is constructed over the property line, is already constructed, that's correct.
and the other one's not.
Correct.
Mr. Privet, do you have any?
Yeah, the surveyors, man. No.
Yeah, that was my question, just to make sure that you own.
No, I own both lots. That's correct. There's actually it's not to do with us, but there's actually a underground that's ran in the wrong price too, but it's neither here nor there, but that's where it started. But we have another drawing that's in there that shows where we pushed the house back at 10,021. Because the lot does open up because it gets wider at the back there. So it would not, it would keep the same proportion that all the other houses, still have the easements and right-of-ways that all the neighboring lots have and stuff.
I think the cul-de-sac.
Yeah, it's a cul-de-sac lot, so it is, it'll still be substantially bigger than most houses even in the neighborhood. If you took a square footage of the lot, 10,021 comparably to all the other houses in the neighborhood, the lot still would be bigger. It's still going to be significantly bigger than most houses, most lots in that neighborhood. Most lots in that neighborhood are like 55 by 120. As you can see by the size of this lot, it's significantly bigger. The only issue we have is the frontage of the lot.
Board members, any questions, comments, or motions?
I'll make a say the peculiarity is definitely there, for sure. And then awesome surveyors that kept it the property. Jeez, 10 feet. Anyways, I'll approve case number 14693 for the reasons that it meets the statutory requirements for variance.
I'll second. I'm sympathetic to the surveyor.
Thank you.
Motion and a second with sympathy to approve case number 14693 for the reasons that it meets the statutory conditions for variance. Cast your votes, please. And it's approved.
Thank you.
Item 10, case 14694, request of Far West Bend LLC for a variance to the special building line along Classen Boulevard at 1007 Northwest 10th Street.
Good afternoon. Tim Johnson with Johnson & Associates here on behalf of the applicant. This is a project that has been before you before. The client requested several variances to allow for, which were granted, to allow for them to get through their financing aspect of this program. So that happened with this, and then we've now got it zoned. It's DTD 1, and which now releases all those variances because it's now permitted by right in the zoning code. And so we're here before you today specifically on the blue line on the drawing that's shown there, the building line that was established based on a setback requirement from the center line of Classen many, many years ago. And it was discussed at the Downtown Review Committee, and it was recommended by the staff that we come get this variance because in this case, staff agrees with the applicant. We want to push the building right to the property line. And with that setback from the center line of Classen, that would prohibit us from being on the property line. And we'd create a little unusable space on the east side of the building. So this project is as you may recall, is a Oklahoma City Housing Authority project, and these are homes for retired elderly, and specifically set up for low income. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Favorable comments note that the setbacks, these current requirements, it's kind of anticipated that these are going to change when the code's updated. Do you have any comments on that or experience with that?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Yeah, it just discusses how these building lines are, the intention is to possibly repeal these when the code's updated? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the intent, and that's the conversations we've had with the staff.
Board members, any questions or comments? I didn't have anyone here to signed up to speak. If we have any motions.
Motion to approve case number 14694.
I'm okay. I'll second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second to approve case number 14694 for the reasons that it meets the statutory conditions for a variance. Cast your votes, please.
Thank you.
And it's approved.
Item 12 is 14645, appeal of Redbud Restoration of the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission regarding the denial of a certificate of appropriateness to demolish a building at 104 Northwest 20th Street.
Good afternoon, David Box, 522 Colcord Drive. I am here on behalf of the property owner, Ms. Vaughn, who is also here. Also with me is my associate Mason Schwartz, as well as Tim Johnson and Mark Zitzow. This is a matter that was continued from the last hearing. I want to do whatever the chair tells me to do, but perhaps it would make some sense to handle the evidentiary issue. If the board would permit, or go ahead, Chairman.
I think the motion to limit evidence should be first, because if the outcome is to remand, we can save the rest of the presentation. If not, then we can hear the rest of it. So I think that goes first.
I'm going to allow Mr. Schwartz to argue the legal side of this. I want to give one element of the practical side of remand. If you think about the case that came before the board several months ago, and it was remanded to the HP Commission. If you recall there, the reason it was remanded, and the reason, frankly, I asked to have it remanded, was we had this anomaly where we had submitted information to staff that because of a glitch in the email, no fault of our own, they didn't get. Here, Mr. Bill Carey and HPI was actively protesting this case. They appeared at the Historic Preservation Commission. So I believe to allow them to now, when they tried to build their case after the appeal was filed, would be an inequity to my client. Because at what point is enough enough? I mean, we could be remanded, and then they could do the same and just keep hiring experts. All the points that they made from this podium to the HP Commission. It was after that that they decided perhaps we should find an expert that agrees with me. And whether or not they actually have an expert that agrees is a matter we can get into. But from the practical side of things, it serves as an inequity, I think, in this case, when they were fully aware of the issues, they were fully aware that they could have hired an expert to support their position, and they failed to do that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Schwartz to argue the municipal code and the legal side of why I believe that their evidence is evidence that should be discarded.
Good afternoon. Mason Schwartz, 522 Colcord Drive. I'll be brief on the legal side of it. We did submit briefs. I think the opposition submitted briefs as well. It really boils down to whether or not this board should be considering the various information, including the reports that were submitted after the decision from the HP Commission below. This court's review on appeals is governed, the scope of review is governed by the municipal code. For most appeals to the Board of Adjustment, municipal code provides for de novo review, which this board is aware is review anew, which is hearing the case, the evidence for a second time, and having no deference to the decision of the board below. However, the code specifically provides for a limited version of that de novo review when it's appeal from the HP Commission, which is the case here. And in that case, Chapter 59, 42, 50.4, subsection K, specifically states that the appeal, and this is from specifically applying to appeals from HP Commission, the appeal shall be heard and tried de novo by the board, and provided such appeal shall be limited to the issues and evidence presented to and decided by the Commission. So we think the language in terms of the scope of this board's review here is pretty clear. One note on the language that deals with the remand that the chairman had brought up and the briefs for the opposition included, there is a portion of that subsection of the code that contemplates remand, and the language is in the event that new evidence is presented. Here, that's exactly what we're asking this court to avoid. We're asking this court to prohibit new evidence from being presented, and so we're not having to deal with that remand clause. But even when you look at that remand clause and think about it practically, this clause is in place for when new evidence is seeking to be produced at the Board of Adjustment that might have some sort of effect on the HP Commission's decision if it were remanded, which is not the case here. The HP Commission denied our applicant's application below, and the new evidence is seeking to be produced by the opposition. And so there's nothing that would lead us to believe that just bolstering the argument in favor of how the HP Commission ruled below would change anything about how the HP Commission ruled. So we don't think the remand language applies. We think the piece of the ordinance that specifically talks about limiting the review to the evidence and the issues presented below controls. And so for that reason, from the outset, we're asking this board to limit its considerations to not include those reports and information that were submitted after the decision, the final decision from the HP Commission. Happy to answer any questions. If not, turn it back over to David.
One question. Well, a couple questions, but I read your motion as essentially possibly seeking two forms of relief. One is limiting our review to only things that were considered, evidence and issues that were considered at HP Commission. But also, there's a line in here in the conclusion about prohibiting evidence or issues from being presented to the board. And so I kind of want to understand the relief that you're seeking precisely so that we can make a precise decision. Is it that presented or considered by the board, or both?
I think what we're asking for is for you to not consider the new evidence, that being all of the reports that came in subsequent to the HP Commission. Certainly the issues were raised. Mr. Carey appeared and off the cuff said, I've been in the house and I could fix it. So certainly you can consider that, and he can come up here and perhaps parade a bunch of my neighbors up to this podium to explain how they could also fix this house. But to introduce new expert reports and put additional things at issue allows for, I think, a major inequity to my client. So what we're asking for is to discard the new reports that were produced.
I'll kind of give you my struggle with that, among many, not with your point, but with the issue. The code, when we're contemplating appeal, says, upon review, the board can affirm, reverse, modify, etc., or the board shall remand the case to commission based upon new evidence in the event that new evidence is presented. And so that, I think, tips in favor of, well, it expressly contemplates new evidence being presented, or else we wouldn't have any basis to remand. So you must have the ability to present new evidence, but the board can't rely on it. That's kind of my reading of it.
Except I do think that it's, when you look at what the board hears appeals from, it's a wide array of different commissions, right? It's the Urban Design Commission, Downtown Design Review, HP, and each of those have their own section within the municipal code as it relates to what happens here. And specifically, under the Historic Preservation Review, 594250.4 sub K sub D, it says, the appeal shall be heard and tried de novo by the board, provided such appeal shall be limited to the issues and evidence presented to and decided by the commission. So I think the code contemplates what you're talking about and further limits it in HP appeals that perhaps it doesn't in other types of appeals.
Board members, any questions for the movement? We'll hear from Mr. Work on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Kelly Work, and my address is 105 North Hudson, Suite 304, and I'm appearing today as attorney for Historical Preservation, Inc., which serves as the neighborhood association, essentially, for the Heritage Hills and Heritage Hills East neighborhoods. And you should have the briefs that we submitted in response to this issue about the scope of the review by the board on an appeal from the Historic Preservation Commission. And it's clear from the ordinance that the review is not merely an appellate review. It's not merely a review of the record. The ordinance clearly specifies that this, when it comes before the Board of Adjustment on appeal from the HP Commission, there is to be a trial de novo. And the trial de novo is defined by the Oklahoma Supreme Court to mean that there must be a complete examination of all issues, both of fact and law. The cause stands as if it has never been resolved before. Now, the issue, and this is, we included this in our brief, but this issue about, well, that anyone opposing the relief that's being requested now that it's being heard de novo from the Board of Adjustment, before the Board of Adjustment, should be excluded from presenting additional evidence is contrary to the concept, to the notion of a trial de novo. The ordinance, I think...
Just on that issue, before we get away from that issue, is there a difference between using the word de novo in an appellate court in the state of Oklahoma, for example, or even a federal court, and a municipal proceeding like this? Is there a difference? I mean, I see there's potentially being a difference because there's limiting language in the code that says, provided that the issues and evidence and things like that will be limited to whatever was presented below, whereas that limiting language might not exist in a normal state court proceeding, in which case the cases you've cited might not be applicable.
Let me suggest in response to your point, the question that you raised, what the ordinance says is that the hearing on appeal is trial de novo, and then it goes on to say the appeal is limited to the issues and evidence presented to and decided by the commission. So the appeal is the complaint that has been filed by the party that was denied approval before the Historic Preservation Commission. So what the ordinance is saying is that in your appeal to the Board of Adjustment, you can't bring new issues and new argument that you didn't present to the HP Commission when you were before them seeking relief. But it does not, the purpose of the ordinance is not to exclude parties who are opposing the relief that's being requested from presenting evidence to the Board of Adjustment. There's public notice of this hearing before the Board of Adjustment on the appeal. There's both published notice and mailed notice. Persons are invited to appear before the Board of Adjustment to participate in the trial de novo that's going to be held before the Board of Adjustment. So it would be contrary to the purpose of the ordinance for the board to take the position that the applicant, that the appellant is asserting that the parties who are opposing should be precluded from presenting any evidence that wasn't presented to the HP Commission. That just, it wouldn't be fair. If, however, the board decides this case, there is an appeal provided to the Oklahoma County District Court. At the Oklahoma County District Court, it would be a trial de novo. It would be all over again. The parties would each have an opportunity to present any and all evidence they chose to consider. This appeal is no different before the Board of Adjustment, in our view. The ordinance does limit and require the appellant to limit their notice of appeal to the issues that were presented to the HP Commission. That is how I think you can consistently read the ordinance to both allow a trial de novo where the parties that are opposing can present additional evidence to the board at this hearing.
Yeah, and consistent with your point, I'm thinking of a hypothetical where you have a hearing at the HP Commission and then it comes up on appeal, and then you have a protestant that signs up and speaks on the matter. Is that protestant limited to the exact comments that they made at HP Commission? Probably not. I think your point is that they're not. They can express their concerns, and in those concerns might be new evidence that wasn't presented below. Does that mean we need to remand? I guess that's the issue before us today. But
if that were the case, then it would just be an appeal on the record, and it's clear that's not what the ordinance provides. Thank you.
Board members,
I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of Mr. Work?
Briefly, I think that is exactly what the ordinance provides. This idea that it's limiting language just to our notice of appeal, if that was the case, then up in K sub 2, sub A sub 1, when it's describing the process and the method of appeal, when it actually uses the words notice of appeal, it would limit it there. This isn't talking about the notice of appeal. This is talking about what happens here at the Board of Adjustment, the decision on appeal by the board, not the written notice of appeal. And so I think that's exactly what it does. It doesn't mean somebody can't come and protest, but to introduce not neighborhood complaints, but new evidence through experts that wasn't considered below, that didn't even exist below, I think gets far afield from what the ordinance clearly lays out.
Board members, any comments or? I mean, I can express my comments. I think that the code contemplates the presentation of new evidence at these hearings in front of the Board of Adjustment. But at least how I read the code, we cannot rely on the new evidence that's presented. And to the extent that we are going to rely on the new evidence that's presented, then with whatever our decision is, then we need to remand the case. In addition to that, I think the evidence that's presented here is in support of HP Commission's decision. And for that reason, I don't know that this is new evidence. I mean, I think these issues were contemplated at HP Commission. I think that the result of what the expert report is was discussed at HP Commission. So I don't know that this is new evidence in the first place. And kind of where I come out on this right now would be to grant the motion in part. And it would be to grant the motion with regard to the request that we not consider the new evidence, but to deny the motion to the extent that it requests that we strike this expert report from the record or disallow it from being presented. So that's kind of where I come out.
I just kind of want to hear the case.
I can't make a motion, but if I did, that's what my motion would be. So to grant the motion in part so that we don't consider it, and whatever our decision is here, it would need to expressly state that we're not relying on the new evidence, but to deny the motion to the extent that it says that the respondent can't present the new evidence to us. Well, are there any comments or anything that needs to be cleared up in the minds of the board members? Either by the move-in, the respondent, city staff, or my thoughts?
Just surveyor, no attorney.
Well, I'm assuming this goes across the street to district court, no matter what we do, somebody. So I think we need to move this on. So my motion is going to be to allow the presentation and the consideration of the new evidence. And then we'll move on to the next step.
I would not, well, I'm only one member, but I wouldn't support that motion, just because I think the code, to me, it's pretty clear that we cannot consider it. I think we can, it can be presented, but I don't think we can consider it in our overall determination. And I think the code's pretty clear that if we do consider it, then it should have been remanded to HP. So that would be my only objection to that motion as presented, but I'm only one member and I can be outvoted. So.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time a motion died for lack of seconds. So.
I guess for me it's just what is this evidence and how different is it? I mean, or it's the same?
My understanding is it's the expert report from, I think it was the mold, on the mold issue.
The guy that said it could be done.
Yeah. So it would be limited to that, excluding our consideration of that evidence.
Could I make a comment just in response to that, to Mr. Privett's comment? Actually, since the HP Commission, we have had an inspection done of the property by a structural engineer, Gary McCracken. He prepared a report. We then had an inspection done by Donald Nist, who's an industrial hygienist, with respect to this issue about the mold. He's prepared two different reports. He had prepared a report and then did an additional one after his physical inspection. So neither of those reports and none of that information was before the HP Commission. That's all been done since the decision, since this appeal was filed by the party, by the appellant.
And you would want the admission of all of that evidence?
Yes, sir.
With the understanding that if it were admitted, we would need to remand the case to HP.
Well, to your point, Mr. Chairman, we would submit that they're not new issues, that the issue about the structural integrity, it's just responding to the issue that was discussed and presented at the HP Commission. The appellant has submitted reports from structural engineers with respect to the condition of the structure, and then they submitted a lab report from an air quality company. So those issues were presented and heard before the HP Commission.
Well, I would agree it's not a new issue, but it is new evidence.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
am I wrong? Is it favoring the original decision by the HP Commission?
It is, but, and I don't want to put words in Mr. Work's mouth, but I presume that the argument is they want as much evidence that buttresses that HP Commission's decision that they can get in for our consideration.
So we
Because he
remand
risks-
it goes back, it gets denied again, then comes back to us, and then goes to court.
I mean, if HP Commission is consistent and they have already rejected this certificate of appropriateness once, then they get more evidence that supports the rejection. Presumably, they would have the same decision, but I don't want to guess what they would do. But I mean, I assume you would want the board to consider that evidence for the reasons of appeal because it supports that decision.
Well, yes. I think I would encourage you, too, just to think about the practical effect of what you're suggesting, what you may be deciding here, because not every case with the HP Commission is going to require that the parties fully gear up and hire experts and prepare expert reports. And, but if the position of the Board of Adjustment is that, well, none of that information can be presented to the Board of Adjustment unless it was first presented to the HP Commission, that's going to present some issues at the HP Commission level, because other cases that you might not think otherwise would require that level of gearing up because there's going to be a subsequent review. It means all of that's going to have to be done at the HP Commission, and that's just a practical effect. I'm not sure that's what the council intended when they adopted the ordinance that provided there would be a new trial in front of the Board of Adjustment.
Yeah, and one other consideration I have, and I don't know which way this tips, probably depends on each of your future clients, but conceivably to me, the one problem with the wording of this is it can't be the case that anytime there's any new evidence, we have to remand. That can't be the case, even though that's what it says in this one sentence. That can't be the practical effect, because practically what that would mean is anyone that wants to hold up any kind of project can lose on appeal and then submit any new piece of evidence and say, it says you shall remand, and hold up the project into perpetuity. The example I use as a kind of an absurd hypothetical is Mr. Box's receipt from his lunch. He presents that and says, Board, I have new evidence here. It says you shall remand. If I have new evidence, this is new evidence. That's absurd. But there's a spectrum there, and I think here, this is arguably not new evidence because I think these issues were discussed, and it's supporting the lower commission's decision. So again, I think you could present it, but I don't think that we can rely on it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, because, I mean, what was presented, in my opinion, was not evidence. It was the oral testimony of one person. There was no evidence from any experts. It was one person standing at the podium saying, I've walked in it, I could fix the house. That's not evidence. That's conclusory testimony. So to support that conclusory testimony, they then went and hired experts. And I think it's worth noting, this was a case that was continued multiple times at the HP level. HPI had every opportunity to hire Mr. Work, hire the experts to go combat the only actual evidence that's in the record that it can't be fixed. And they didn't do that. So to allow them to do that is akin to me showing up and presenting my lunchtime receipt, because the inequity that would be created, which would be created here, I think would be absurd.
Well, I would take issue with Mr. Box's characterization of testimony not being evidence. Testimony clearly is evidence in any body. And the issue about the continuances, there was additional information that was requested to be provided from the applicant, which resulted in the continuances. And then at the May meeting, the HP Commission made a decision to go do a site inspection themselves. So between May and July, they took the time to go do that. So there, I mean, it wasn't that there was the opposition that was the result or causing the continuances.
I still kind of come out on the same side. I think it can be presented. I just don't think we can rely on it. If we have a motion that's consistent with that or different from that, but we need some kind of motion to resolve this. I can't make a motion, so it's up to other board members.
I'll make that the motion. There you go, how about that? Exactly what it is, I don't know.
Okay, I'll second it so we can vote.
Right.
Well, what's the motion? Is it present it but not consider it, or something different?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. A motion and a second to grant the motion in part, such that the board can, or the respondent can present new evidence, but the board cannot consider the new evidence. Cast your votes, please. And it's approved.
Okay.
It's now starting the substance of the appeal.
Yes, yes. So I'm going to have, Mark, if you could, I'm going to have 3 people that will speak, myself, as well as Ms. Vaughn, the owner of the property, and as well as Mr. Johnson, the engineer that will be proffering the expert testimony. Before I turn it over to Ms. Vaughn, I do want to walk through the exhibits before you. These are all exhibits that are in the record, but in an effort to provide them in a manner that is easier to follow, I put them in a tab notebook. A copy has also been provided to Mr. Work. What you'll see at tab 1 is the staff report from the HP Commission dated 3/6/2019. That would have been the first time in which it would have come before the HP Commission. Tab 2 is the 5/1/2019 staff report, that being the second time it would have come before the Commission. 3, finally, 7/3/19, the time in which the HP Commission took action on it. 4 is the field observation report prepared by Johnson and Associates. Tab 5 is the report on residential inspection prepared by Robert Zoll. 6 is some correspondence between my client and a contractor that's specifically called out in I believe, the Heritage Hills newsletter as a person that is consistent and good at renovating historic homes. The purpose of this, as you see, is this contractor who's put out as an HP contractor says, I agree with the structural engineer. There's not anything to work with on the rebuild. Finally, 7 are various photographs of Mr. Johnson that were included within his report, 2 of which are on exhibit boards on both my left and my right. So before I speak and Mr. Johnson speaks, I do want you to hear from the owner of the property, because one of the things that we often hear in these HP cases is the owners are somehow vilified in that what they're trying to do is contrary to the mission of historic preservation. This house has major problems due to years and years of neglect. None of that neglect was the result of my client's actions. My client bought the property after the decade or more of neglect had occurred. They purchased the property with the specific intent to rehabilitate it. It was only after they hired professionals to rehabilitate the property that they realized this was in such a state of condition that they could not rehabilitate it. So I think that's an important note, because there is this phenomenon in HP of demolition by neglect, where property owners allow the property to become so bad that there is no choice. That is not what we have here. So with that, I want to turn it over to Ms. Vaughn to give you her story on this property.
Just for clarity's sake,
yes, sir?
On this Exhibit 6 or Tab 6,
yep,
the messages, were these presented below? I didn't see these in the record earlier. Okay. At least in our packet, I didn't see these.
Yeah, so Ms. Vaughn came and explained her process and how this happened.
Okay.
It's my understanding this was submitted to HP. If it's
the messages themselves?
Perhaps just the substance.
Okay.
I'm happy to remove it from the... You can read it and don't consider it.
Right, yeah. That's
happy to do that.
To be consistent with our prior...
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I'm staff to the HP Commission. I believe the messages were verbally reported out to the Commission. We didn't have copies of them, so it's probably all good.
Okay, thank you.
That's exactly right. Mary Lynn Vaughn, currently 1709 South Soleil Cove in Salt Lake City, Utah. I do have an apartment here, though, as well, in Oklahoma City. And 45-year resident of Oklahoma City. My husband took a job in Utah, and that's why we moved, but my family still resides in Oklahoma City. My son is at 2100 Robinson, which is at the corner of 20th and Robinson, and I have a home at 21st and Broadway, which my mother currently lives in. I purchased the 2 homes. It was a package deal at 100 and 104 Northwest 20th. And I started out kind of as a little home do-it-yourselfer, and since then I
Sorry
have...
to interrupt. This will be relevant later, but how much, do you recall, did you purchase these?
$218.
For both?
Yes.
Okay.
It might have been $216. We had a roof issue, but they were asking $218. I paid full price. And then we had a little reduction due to the roof for both of these homes. And my intention, my daughter-in-law was pregnant at the time, and since I kind of enjoy handiwork, was to renovate 104. I've done a home in Gatewood, had structural issues. We had to jack it up for a new foundation. I've taken things down to the studs 4 or 5 times, done things that just looked absolutely horrible. So this was a package deal. I did a cursory observation of the home and thought, oh, I can handle this. This is okay. And then 100 is a rental, so we just bought both of them, and it was rented out. It had a tenant in it. So I was going to be down the street from my son, my new grandchild, and then my mom's around the corner. And so we closed November 2nd of last year, and November 19th was my violation. Orange sticky note on the window. Almost every box was checked, absolutely everything. I knew it was in bad shape, but I didn't realize, how bad. So I started with a structural engineer, and he said, this is bad, and I can't give my complete opinion on how bad the termite damage is, but you need to have that checked out as well. So that's when I got the termite inspection, and I was told over 80% affected bad. I mean, like, not just, there's a little, shell here that the wood was just really destroyed. And so then we went to, I think that was, I'm kind of getting my dates confused. I think we went to the first HP hearing with just maybe 1 structural engineer, no, possibly 2. The second structural engineer report was just, there's no salvaging this. And I thought, I've never torn a house down. I was in Heritage Hills, received the maintenance award in 2014 for my home at 300 Northwest 16th. My husband was on HPI. I was treasurer of numerous things in Heritage Hills, home tour treasurer. I mean, I did a lot. It wasn't no intent whatsoever to go in and tear this house down. It's just the only bid I got out of 9 was almost $300,000. And he said, and I'm not sure that that's going to cover it. We are going to have, if they make us, replace stick by stick, it's going to be $300,000 when you have that much termite damage to replace this 969 square foot home. That was just not feasible. And so as the reports came in and we got Tim involved and saw the mold issue, I didn't want to spend the money to do that. But again, my intent was not to tear the home down to start with.
I will forgive you if you don't have an exact recollection of every page of all the documents, but do you know where there's any evidence of the estimate of $300,000? At least it's in the record.
Yes, I do. I can get his name. Central Construction.
It's in the evidence that's...
I don't know that I ever presented it in evidence. I don't actually remember.
There was 3 reports. Only 2 of them are here, but in the actual record transmitted from HP, the 3rd that isn't here, I think, would have that number.
Board members, any questions or comments? Okay. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to have Mr. Johnson walk through his analysis. Mr. Johnson was the individual that I recommended Ms. Vaughn hire. I was not involved until right before the July hearing. I recommended Mr. Johnson not because I had any doubts about the previous reports, but Mr. Johnson and I work together quite often on these types of matters, and in fact had just wrapped up a case that's fairly similar, actually right next to my home at 508 Northwest 15th Street, in which there was a garage, and we presented evidence through Mr. Johnson's office that it was in need of demolition. HP staff recommended approval, just like they do here, and in that case, HP Commission did approve the demolition of that garage. So that's why I asked Mr. Johnson to appear, because he is familiar with the city, what they look for in these boards and commissions. So with that, I'd have Mr. Johnson give a synopsis of his report.
Good afternoon, Tim Johnson, 1 East Sheridan, Suite 200, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I am owner of Johnson & Associates, and for background, I'm a graduate structural engineer from the University of California at Cal Poly, Pomona, California. I've been practicing engineering in Oklahoma City for 43 years, and we've done a lot of investigations like this for various homeowners across the city and state. Although my current practice is more civil land use, we don't practice a lot of structural, but my background is structural. One thing that I had the benefit of when I was preparing my report was the information that had been previously submitted to the HP board, which is the termite report that Ms. Vaughn had mentioned, and it's 82% of the property of the building had heavy termite damage, not mild termite damage. That's a big deal. When you talk about the structure and how the structure is built, granted it's a small structure, but it has load-bearing walls around all 4 sides. It has roof systems that have to tie to those load-bearing walls, and when the sill plates get eat up by termites, they move, they compress. The second thing is Bob Zoll, who is probably one of the most well-respected structural engineers in the state. He sits on the board for engineering and surveyors, was the other engineer that made the analysis. I have a lot of respect for him and have worked side by side with him on similar cases like this. So with that, we made our own inspection. I have one of my employees teaches at OSU OKC the inspection program for home inspection certification. He and I went out and made the inspection on this house in person and made the summary and the analysis that was in my report and on our findings. A lot of the information that's been submitted subsequent to this does not present any resolution, does not present a method of repair to do what is necessary to replace the actual structural foundation of the floor and meet code with regard to crawl space. The whole house would have to be raised nearly 3 feet. And there's not room under the current crawl space to get the kind of equipment you need to get to raise it all at one time. The portion of the floor is open in several spots. So we were able to do a visual and take pictures by holding the camera, looking back underneath, and saw the termite damage, saw the fact that some of the cross beams are sitting on broken bricks that are stacked as many as 7 high. And that's what's holding up the middle of this house. Doesn't meet any code or standard. So the entire floor system in the house would have to be removed. All the structural beams would have to be replaced in the entire floor plate. And I don't know how you do that without taking the walls down and rebuilding it from the ground up. What's recommended in the subsequent information that was provided, the report by Mr. McCracken, doesn't really suggest. It says, this is the kind of soils you got, this is why this is happening. The way to fix this is to put screw jacks in there and jack this thing out. Well, there's no room to put a screw jack under there. It's physically impossible. So the second bit of information that was provided by the industrial air quality professional was most of his findings were regarding the current damaged wood. So what's causing the problem from a mold perspective is the fact that we have so much current damaged wood that has absorbed so much moisture over time that it's got to come out first, and then what's remaining has to be treated. At my recommendation, when we did our report, we brought in 1-800-WATER damage. They're a national firm that has a local Oklahoma City office, and we asked them, if this was an insurance submittal, what would you guys do? So normally, if this was water damage in your house, they would come in, they'd cut the sheetrock about 2 feet off the bottom, and they'd begin to move air to get everything dried out. But they certify to your insurance company that the mold is gone before you can build back, before your insurance company will allow you to build back. That's why we asked them to come in, because they're nationally certified, they work with insurance companies, and they're the ones that have to give the certificate to allow for a homeowner to rebuild. When asked about this property and the conditions they found, they didn't think it could be made safe, claimed safe by them. So I guess I'm a little disappointed that in your comment, Mr. Chairman, with regard to there's new evidence that support the HP's findings. You have two long-standing engineers that have written reports on this that find the opposite.
Sure. My comment was only to say that there was some new evidence that was presented, and its only impact on the case would be, if any, would be to support the response.
I misunderstood you then.
Yeah, not that it counters any of the other evidence, but that would be its import on the case.
You know, Mr. Zoll's license number is 10,000, mine's 12,000, and Mr. McCracken's is 17,000. We have a lot of experience that has looked at this. And, as with Bob, I've been around the block a few times and seen a lot of things, and I've personally renovated a house in Mesta Park. I thought because I have my structural background, I could do this, and I spent 12 years on that house. It was not near in the shape that this was, but it had a ton of work to be done on it, and it was very costly and very time-consuming, and we never got the floors level. It was just impossible. So that's a little anecdotal information. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay.
Thank
you. I'll try to be brief. I'm not an engineer. They're the smart people in the room, as I usually say. But what I gather from Tim's analysis and the other reports that are now to be considered by you is that the idea that you could do it is problematic, because in order to lift this structure up a matter of 3 feet, due to the compounding problems of the termite damage and water damage and all the other things, there's nothing left. What you end up with is a pile of rubble and trying to put it back together. And so I want to walk briefly through what happened at the HP Commission, starting at the 3/6/19 hearing, in which staff recommended approval of the demolition. You'll find that tab 1, staff report, page 4 of 5. So they recommended approval. At that time, it was continued. My understanding was it was recommended to be continued to allow for an on-site inspection by the HP Commission members. That's why then at tab 2, the 5/1/19 staff report recommends a continuance. So there was a continuance that occurred at some point in there. It got continued to allow for additional information and reports. That is the time in which I was then hired. Mr. Johnson performed his report. The termite inspection had already been submitted, but then the additional mold and other evidence was submitted. And finally, staff recommends approval in the July 3rd staff report, which is tab 3. And if you turn to page 5 of that staff report, they recommend approval with specific findings. The findings that the applicant has provided documentation from a structural engineer stating that the property is an imminent threat to public health and safety that can only be alleviated through demolition. That is the standard that an applicant must satisfy in order to get a CA to demolish a piece of property located in an area zoned HP. There is no evidence whatsoever in the record for you to consider that counters this point. The only thing in the record is staff recommended approval, 3 separate licensed engineers stating that the documentation is there warranting demolition because the property is an imminent threat to the public health and safety that can only be alleviated through demolition. So because of that, we would ask you to reverse the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission and grant the CA. We'd be happy to answer any additional questions you might have.
I have a couple of questions kind of based on statutory interpretation. My understanding here is you can get a CA and this is under the applicable ordinance L2, and then it talks about the different bases for getting a certificate of appropriateness. And these are, it says, shall only be granted if one of the following occurs. As determined by the commission, the structure is non-contributing to the historic integrity of the historic district, and the demolition will not adversely affect the historic character of the property or district. So that's the first one, and this was considered below. The second is the imminent threat to public health and safety that's been discussed. And again, if any one of these are met, you can get a CA granted. This is my understanding, at least. And then there's D, which concerns garages, which is not applicable, but C, there's no viable economic use of the structure. And then it goes on to talk about what a viable use is. And I have copies of this because for whatever reason this was not in the staff report. It wasn't really discussed. And I guess that's my question to you. Do you know why the subsection C wasn't discussed about the viable use?
So we're not making a claim on the financial viability. My client discussed the cost to redo it. We didn't make that claim. Our claim is based upon the structural integrity. So what Mr. Johnson has testified to in the report state that it's the structural integrity piece that poses the imminent threat to the public health and safety that is the provision that we're seeking to go under. The economic piece of it is not something we sought because we didn't think we had to get there. To get there would mean that you could fix it, but it's too cost prohibitive. What my client's being told by her structural is you can't fix it. It's a physical impossibility.
And I guess that's my concern is there's been a lot of evidence about how dilapidated this is and how cost effective, the cost of doing it is not going to be effective. But I don't know the evidence that it poses particularly an imminent threat to public health and safety. So I guess I want kind of your opinion on what it means to have how this evidence ties to the public health and safety. All the evidence I see is if you enter into the house, it's very dangerous. But that, I don't know, qualifies as a public health issue or public safety issue.
So I think it's a public health issue because one of the first things my client said is, it wasn't days or weeks after she bought it, the city put a yellow or orange sticker on it because she was violating municipal ordinances because you have open holes in the roof, the structure is essentially impossible to secure, and if it's an imminent threat of collapsing and falling, well, at some point then it becomes almost like an attractive nuisance where you've got something that's fallen in and it's inviting the public to come look. And so it becomes an imminent threat to the public if it's in such bad disrepair that that threat can't be alleviated except for removing the structure.
Okay, I understand. That was my kind of struggle is if it's apparently been in this condition, based on the record before us, it's been in this condition for 8 years. I don't know how you meet that imminent threat. It's been like that for 8 years. And also the public element. I mean, I contemplate a giant structure in the middle of downtown that's at risk of falling over. That's the kind of public health and safety thing. And so that could potentially be demolished under this provision. And I could be wrong on that, and that's why I'm asking the questions. But
so I think, I don't know that you're wrong. It's just, I think what it means is when it's to such level of disrepair that there's nothing left to be saved is when it's considered an imminent threat to the public health. Now, could it stand there for another 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Perhaps. Could it also fall down next week? Yes. I mean, one of the things that happens when you have, let's say Ms. Vaughn wasn't a proactive and good property owner, this concept of demolition by neglect. Some people, rather than spending the money on lawyers and engineers, they just let it keep going, and then the city goes and will demolish it themselves and put a lien on the property, right? Because the city started the process of that by putting the sticker on, which forced her to go, okay, well, I'm trying to renovate it. I need to go hire these experts who then have told her it can't be saved.
Okay. Another question I had is on the finding from HP Commission that this, I guess they maybe reject your argument that this is not contributing to the historic character of the property or the area. And I think that's one of the things that you would need to meet, depending on, I guess you can reject this subsection A, which talks about that, and only go under subsection B. But if you're trying to get there under subsection A, which was what the HP Commission found, I think you need to have some kind of evidence how this is not contributing to the historic integrity of the historic district, and that demolition will not adversely affect the historic character. So I guess my question is, are you rejecting that basis?
No, I'm happy. Just like staff, if you look at staff, what they say is, in their findings, that the house is historic and contributes to the integrity of the district. We're fine to concede that point. I don't think we have to combat that point to get to the imminent threat through the structural engineer.
I agree.
So I'm happy to concede that it contributes.
Okay. It's just,
if you think that this contributes.
well, sure. I don't know. Well, we'll get to that. But the reason I ask is because I read these as disjunctive. And by saying that, I mean, if A is met, you can get a CA. And A is, it's not contributing to the historic integrity of the historic district, and demolition will not adversely affect the historic character of the property or district. If you meet that alone, you can get a CA. Or you can move to B, which is the imminent harm to public health and threat and safety. So that's, I'm trying to pinpoint exactly what you're appealing and what you're moving under. It sounds like you've conceded A, so we'll move to B.
Yeah, it's B. It's as evaluated by the Commission, or here, the Board of Adjustment, based upon information including not limited to reports, photographs, inspection, the structure in a state of decay or ruin, imposing an imminent threat to public health or safety, and the demolition of said structure is required to alleviate said threat. That's the provision we're going under, and that's the provision that staff, through their report, and now, through the only evidence that you are to consider, agreed in their specific findings that the applicant provided the documentation of the hazardous air quality, and then 3, the applicant has provided the additional documentation from a structural engineer that the property is an imminent threat to public health and safety that can only be alleviated through demolition.
Okay. They also found that it contributes to the historic character.
Sure.
And that, so I didn't know if you're appealing that issue or not.
I'll just say that when the Commission reviews, again, Katie Friddle, I'm staff to the Historic Preservation Commission. When the Commission reviews a demolition, they always include findings addressing whether or not the property is historic, whether that's up for debate or not, just to lay that out before they proceed with the rest of the debate, because obviously if a property was not historic, if it was a garage someone built in 2004, then we wouldn't go to the next step of discussing whether or not it should be demolished. So that's always included in the findings, but it was not being disputed in the hearings.
Okay. Board members, any questions, comments? Okay. Did you have any other witnesses, or we move on to Mr. Work?
Nope, that's it for us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Again, my name is Kelly Work, and my address is 105 North Hudson, Suite 304. And I'm here representing Historical Preservation, Inc., which is functions as the neighborhood association for the Heritage Hills neighborhood and Heritage Hills East, which combine together under Historical Preservation, Inc. And before I begin my remarks, Mr. Chairman, I do want to address one of the questions that you raised. And perhaps Ms. McDevitt or Ms. Friddle can elaborate, but it's my understanding that that provision of the ordinance that talks about economic viability is only dealing with commercial buildings, that it does not have application to residential properties, and that the issue of economic viability does not come into consideration when you're dealing with a residential structure within the HP district. It's just those two other issues that you were just discussing with Mr. Box.
I don't know that I agree, but I don't think we need to agree on that, because they've conceded that that's not the provision that they're moving under. And so I appreciate your point of raising to the board that economics, in your view, probably shouldn't be considered, I think is your view, or the economic viability shouldn't be considered. But they've conceded that they're not moving on that provision, so we don't need to get into whether it's residential, commercial, or anything.
You had made one comment earlier in response to the owner's suggestion that she had received a bid for $300,000 to repair, that perhaps that would be relevant, and we would submit that it's not at all relevant. And incidentally, there is nothing in the record that we're aware of that shows that bid. There is another structural engineer report that was submitted, but it's not a bid and doesn't include an estimate of the cost of repair.
Okay, yeah, and I was asking her that to set up the question to council on whether they're moving under this provision. But if they're not, I think we can disregard that.
I do have some remarks I want to make, but I want to just first identify a few people that are present, that some of who will offer some testimony after I speak. First is Mr. Bill Carey, who's president of Historical Preservation, Inc. Then also Mr. Gary McCracken, who's been referenced. He is a structural engineer who did prepare a structural report that has been referenced. And then also Mr. Donald Nist, of an industrial hygienist with Tech Ann Inc., which is an environmental and health and safety company that does environmental remediation here in Oklahoma City. As has already been mentioned, this structure at 104 Northwest 20th Street is within the Historic Preservation District. It's part of Heritage Hills East, and it was built in 1920. Is presently, as you can see from the photos, it remains intact, and yes, it is our understanding that it is undisputed that it is contributing to the historic character of the district. After the commission did make a site visit between the May hearing and the July hearing, they then did make a decision to deny the certificate of appropriateness to demolish this residence at the conclusion of the testimony and evidence that was presented at that hearing. In its order denying the application, the commission specifically found both that the house is historic and that it contributes to the integrity of the district, and that the testimony showed that the house was salvageable. In this appeal, of course, the appellant is seeking to have you, as the Board of Adjustment, reverse that decision of the HP Commission and authorize the demolition of the structure. We're opposing that appeal, and we ask that you deny the authorization and that you not allow the demolition of the structure. The application does not meet the very specific requirements under the Oklahoma City Code for demolition of a historic structure, and in our view must therefore be denied. The Oklahoma City Code provides under the zoning ordinance that demolition permits may only be issued with a certificate of appropriateness, and under that section of the code at 59-4250.4, it states that the purpose and findings, the code states, demolition or removal of a historic structure constitutes an irreplaceable loss to the quality and character of the city. Therefore, a certificate of appropriateness shall only be granted if one of the following occurs. As you mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman, the first is the issue of does it contribute. So we're looking then to the second provision of the code, and that one is that if the structure is in a state of decay or ruin and poses an imminent threat to public health or safety, and the demolition of the structure, of said structure, is required to alleviate said threat. And the code goes on to provide that the applicant has the burden of proof to meet those requirements of the ordinance before a demolition permit can be, or a certificate of appropriateness can be authorized for a demolition. Demolitions, of course, are irreversible. They are the most damaging actions that can occur in any historic preservation district. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the City of Oklahoma City's adoption of the Historic Preservation Ordinance, and the success and continued existence of particularly the Heritage Hills East neighborhood owes its success to the fact that 50 years ago the City Council made a determination to preserve the historic neighborhoods, including this one. The house at 104 Northwest 20th is a small one-story wood frame structure. There have been other dwellings in worse condition that have been restored in Heritage Hills and Heritage Hills East. As I mentioned, this structure, and you can see from the photos, it is standing and is still intact. The house was allowed to deteriorate through neglect, unfortunately. There has been no fire or storm or sudden casualty that has caused damage. While the deterioration that has been allowed to occur is not the fault of the current owner, if we allow demolitions for historic structures based on deterioration through neglect, then property owners may be incentivized to neglect their properties and allow them to deteriorate. And the likely result will be more applications for demolition, which would serve to undermine the integrity of the historic district. I mentioned the structural report that has been provided by Gary McCracken. I'm going to call on Gary McCracken in a minute to give some additional testimony. But I want to also bring your attention to the structural report that was submitted by the applicant from professional engineer David Gaskeb, who also concluded that the residence is capable of being repaired. And that report was submitted to the HP Commission, and also we attached it with our response to the notice of appeal. Neither Mr. McCracken's report nor Mr. Gaskeb's report state that the structure is a hazard to public health and safety that can only be alleviated by demolition. In his November 15, 2018 report, Mr. Gaskeb makes recommendations, specific recommendations for what will be required to repair the structure, including replacing the stem wall, bracing the roof, replace moisture-damaged wood in the roof, in the wall and floor areas, rebuild the front porch, repair or rebuild the brick support columns for the porch roof. For the interior, Mr. Gaskeb recommends exposing the floor joists, replacing damaged floor joists, installing new floor supports in the crawl space. There's no suggestion in Mr. Gaskeb's report that the structure is incapable of repair or that it presents a hazard to public health and safety that can only be alleviated through demolition. As I stated, the structure is one that contributes to the historic district, and the ordinance provides that authorization for demolition may only be granted under our code if the structure is in a state of decay or ruin and poses an imminent threat to public health or safety, and that demolition of the structure is required to alleviate the threat. Now, there was Mr. Johnson made reference to a 1-800 water damage that they had called in connection with this property, and they were comments that were presented by Mr. Johnson at the HP Commission about mold in the property and about the difficulty that presented. There is no report in the record from 1-800 water damage, so there's nothing that has been submitted from them in connection with this. We did, as has been mentioned, we did have a report prepared by Don Nist, who's an industrial hygienist, as I mentioned, and you've been provided, he actually did one report that was dated on November 6th, which was prior to his actual physical inspection of the interior of the property, and then he did a subsequent report on November 27 after he had been allowed permission to inspect the interior of the property. And this has previously been submitted, but I'd like to just circulate copies so that you can have them at this time. Mr. Nist is present here today, but he is unable to give testimony verbally because he is recovering from throat surgery that he had on November 25th. So he's present and has a whiteboard and could be available to answer questions that you may have, but he's under doctor's orders during his recovery not to speak. So I'd like to just very briefly just highlight a couple of his comments, and I did highlight those in yellow on the two reports that are stapled together that have been handed out to you. And after he did have a chance to go and inspect the interior, his initial report was based on the review of the lab report that had been submitted by the applicant, which included the results of the air quality test, and then also the report that had been submitted by Mr. Johnson, which included quite a lot of photos of the interior. But then he did have a chance, as I mentioned, between his first report on the 6th of November and the 27th to actually do a physical inspection. And he does conclude in his report that normal mold remediation activities can be conducted at this residence. He says there in the November 27, I observed no large or overwhelming mold growth locations anywhere in the residence. And then he does suggest, because the suggestion was made that this would present a threat to persons that might be going in the residence, and Mr. Nist does recommend that when remediation efforts are done, that the personnel conducting those remediation efforts should wear appropriate safety gear. And then he does include also a recommendation that if necessary, there is a chlorine dioxide fumigation process that can be utilized as a sure way, in his words, to kill all mold within the contained residence environment. But the suggestion was made at the HP Commission that this presented, that this issue of there having been mold identified in the structure was in some way a public safety hazard, and that provided justification for demolition. That was the only reasonable step that could be taken would be to demolish the property. And what Mr. Nist's reports reflect, in our view, is that it is certainly possible for remediation to be done of the mold that is existing in the property. Based on Mr. Nist's examination of the mold report, and again, the mold report that was submitted just gives the results of the measurements and mold counts that were taken from the air quality. The mold report does not draw any conclusions. It doesn't make any recommendations. It just gives the specific counts. The mold spores that are occurring in the house are common varieties. They're largely limited to a room inside the southwest corner of the house, and it's entirely capable of remediation. It hasn't been mentioned here today, but there was reference made to the specific mold type at the HP Commission, and that there was a high count that was reflected with respect to a particular mold type that's called the Aspergillus penicillium mold, and that is a garden variety. Those are garden variety mold types that you will find in virtually every building, and they are readily capable of remediation with the proper steps, as Mr. Nist identifies in his report. The July 3rd, 2019 staff report, which recommended approval, was based in large part on the erroneous conclusion that the air quality within the structure was, quote, in the staff's word, infeasible to remedy, close quote. And so that statement is just not correct. The As Mr. Nist's report explains, it is certainly feasible to remedy the mold that is existing within the structure and restore it to a good condition. Just to summarize, as has been mentioned already, under the code, in order to authorize demolition, the appellant must prove that the structure poses an imminent threat to public health or safety, and demolition is required to alleviate said threat. There is no imminent threat posed to the public health and safety by any condition of the house at 104 Northwest 20th Street. The structure can be restored and continue to contribute to the historic character of the neighborhood and the district. Demolition would be an irreplaceable loss to the neighborhood and the district. The applicant's burden of proof has not been met. The decision of the HP Commission to deny the request to demolish the house at 104 Northwest 20th is correct and should be affirmed. At this time, I'd like to call on Gary McCracken to come forward and give some remarks about his inspection of the property and what his conclusions and recommendations are.
Good afternoon. I'm Gary McCracken. I completed a structural inspection on subject property on September 11th, 2019. Property records indicate the house was built in 1920, approximately 969 square feet. It's a wood framed on a concrete stem wall with a wood floor framing. Initially, looked at the porch deck, was deteriorated, and my recommendation was to replace the framing and the decking. And looked at around the perimeter. The siding was in good condition. Parging on the existing stem wall was spalled off. My recommendation there was to restore the parging on it and to extend the life of the stem wall. I did an inspection in the crawl space from the east corner of the front porch. It was too small to physically go into. It was determined to be damp, and the floor framing is supported with one center girder beam going down the center of it, and it was severely deflected. When I entered the interior, the plaster was predominantly removed from the walls, and the center portion from the east to the west of the flooring was deteriorated. Most of the decking subflooring was rotted or removed. I could see termite damage across it, and the floor was deflecting towards the interior of the building. My recommendation there was to remove the flooring and replace the floor joists, the sills, and any rotted or termite damaged studs. And then shore up the existing flooring with a 6x6 center beam with heavy-duty screw jacks. And on the roof was observed to have deflection in all faces of the east and west face and along the valleys and the ridges. Did a visual inspection inside. The joists appeared that weren't damaged by water appeared to be good condition. I recommended to install additional bracing underneath to support to remove or support the deflection. Did see that there was a tree branch up on the roof that appeared to have penetrated the roof, and that's where a lot of the water was coming in from. So recommendation was to remove the tree branches and then replace the roof and repair any fixes to the leak. So if you have any questions on my report,
Mr. McCracken, if you could just address the issue that was discussed by Mr. Johnson, where he was discussing what would be required to be done to replace the floor joist. If you could just describe how that could be done.
Well, the floor joist, the existing subfloor would have to be removed, and then you'd have to put a new girder beam underneath, and then you're going to have to brace up the walls, existing walls, and put new floor joists in between the sill plate and the subfloor. And then the shoring would be, you could jack up the flooring after you have all the joists in there. And there is approximately 16 inches underneath the existing girder beam, and I estimate about 20 inches between the existing of the bottom joist to the floor, in which the existing industrial residential building code requires 18 inches and 12 under the girders. So for conventional wood framing, so you wouldn't have to have any pressure treated. Any
Board
further
members,
questions?
any questions? Okay. Thank you. And then, Mr. Worker, this was a report done after HP Commission?
That is correct.
Okay. So this is one that it can be presented, but ultimately can't rely on it in our decision.
I should have, in my introduction of Mr. McCracken, forgive me, I neglected to identify what his credentials are. He is a 1986 graduate with a bachelor's degree in structural engineering. He's been a licensed professional engineer since 1994. He was chief design engineer for Tinker Air Force Base from 1996 to 2000. And then in 2005, he established Metro Engineering, which does residential structural evaluations. And to date, he has completed 4,850 residential structural evaluations. But with that, then I'd like to call on Bill Carey, who I mentioned is president of the Historical Preservation, Inc., which serves as the neighborhood association. I'd like to introduce him at this time.
Good afternoon. I am Bill Carey. I live at 326 Northwest 16th. I am currently president of Historical Preservation, Inc., the Neighborhood Association for Heritage Hills and Heritage Hills East. I've lived in the neighborhood for 42 years.
I'm going to pause you for just 1 second. We're going to try to sort through a quorum issue.
Okay, sorry.
So we have one board member that needs to leave in the next couple of minutes, and so for the appellant and respondent or appellee, any decision by the board will need to be unanimous. So just want to advise the parties of that, and we'll address that with council, but just wanted to get that on the record now. So,
okay.
But
So
please
proceed.
continue. Yeah.
Okay. Started to say I've lived in the neighborhood for 42 years in 3 different historic properties. 50 years ago, this year, Preservation Ordinance and the formation of Historic Preservation, Inc. were done to prevent destruction and significant alteration of historic properties in the neighborhoods, as well as to restrict the change of use and commercial encroachment in the neighborhood, in Heritage Hills specifically. We have always worked hard and hand in hand with the HP Commission to preserve and protect the historic nature of Heritage Hills and Heritage Hills East neighborhoods and the houses within them. Part and parcel to that, we have always strongly opposed demolition as a solution to a rundown property, believing that destruction chips away at the historic fabric of the neighborhood. I have been around every type of residential construction since I was 16 years old. Was in the lumber business for 20 years. have built single-family homes up to a 92-unit condominium project. I'm not the new kid on the block. I've remodeled numerous houses, including a half dozen in the neighborhood. Some in equal or worse condition than the house at 104 Northwest 20th. I have done 2 that were burnouts and were on the dilapidation list for the city awaiting demolition. Never using a general contractor in any of this. I've got some pictures of one I want to show you. I'd like to show you one rehab that we did in 2016 because it was worse than this house.
And just, I know this was discussed at the HP Commission, but did you present these pictures at the HP Commission?
No.
Okay.
311 Northwest 22nd, not too far from the subject. It sat partially open to the elements for 5 or 6 years. Bad settling, rot, broken foundation in 3 places. I'm sure it had termites and mold. We stripped it, removed and replaced whole sections of the stem wall, added piers, reframed most of the interior, built a new garage, driveway, and sewer line, put on a new roof, rewired, and replumbed it, drywalled it, and finished it out. It is larger than this house at 1,750 feet, but more complicated because it was 2-story. We completely rehabbed that house from the ground up for $120,000, and it's nearly twice the size of the house. Go figure. I have walked the house at 104 Northwest 20th on 2 or 3 occasions, and in my opinion, it can and should be fixed. Wood frame construction, wood frame houses are pretty simple. They're simple to build, they're simple to fix. You got to remember, this is 1,000 square feet. This house would fit inside this chamber. It's not complicated. There's another house a block away from 104 Northwest 20th, at 201 Northwest 20th, that is currently being rebuilt. I was in it early on also, and it was every bit as bad as 104 20th. It's well on its way to completion. You should drive by and look at it. It looks like it's going to be a great renovation. This demolition request must be an economic problem or an opportunity for the owners. It's not a structural problem that can't be fixed. Perhaps an addition to the existing house would improve the economics. The neighborhood considers these small bungalows as historically significant and are worthy of preserving. We don't know what the applicant's plans are if they are allowed to demolish it, but we do know that demolition is permanent for this house. We also have 2 fears in these situations in demolishing a house that can be renovated. The next application of the HP Commission may, just may, be for the construction of a new house that is much larger and out of character with those in the neighborhood. The second would be a SPUD application to build 2 to 3 2-story houses on this single-family lot, similar to one approved in the Linwood Conservation District recently. These 2 possibilities are a real danger to the historic character of the neighborhood. In closing, I would reiterate that the HP Commission went out and inspected this house. 2 of their members have experience in the business, and 2 are architects. The Commission then voted to deny it. This house should not be torn down. It is secured and closed up. It has not been cited for dilapidation by the city. It is not an imminent threat to anyone. Thank you for your time and consideration and your service.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to call on Dr. Bob Blackburn, who is present to give testimony. Dr. Blackburn is Executive Director of the Oklahoma Historical Society, and also, together with his wife, Debbie Blackburn, owns property within the Heritage Hills East neighborhood nearby.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Blackburn. I live at 1515 Northwest 35th in historic neighborhood of Putnam Heights now. But I'd like to make comments, two different perspectives, one personal and one professional. The personal is that I have owned and restored 3 homes in Heritage Hills, one of which has been described by many of these comments today. In fact, Shannon was my real estate agent when I bought it. For you young people, you always grimace, but I paid $11,000 for it in Heritage Hills and restored it. It's still a contributing building to the neighborhood. I'm still very proud of the way it looks, and it's a classic 1919 bungalow. But that's the personal side. The professional side is that I've been doing the histories of Oklahoma City since 1979. I've been at the Historical Society since then. I wrote the history of Heritage Hills in 1985. I've written 25 books on different topics of Oklahoma history, and I'm State Historic Preservation Officer. Really, my comments today are not to get involved in the condition of this particular house. I'm really here to be support of the HP Commission in its extreme reluctance to ever approve demolition of a garage or a house. And I've seen the process work. I'm here to support that on 2 different levels. One is in standards. We all have standards. Every profession, whether you're an attorney or in construction, an engineer, or real estate, you have the standards by which you live. With an HP ordinance, now 50 years old, we have standards that we have to administer. I administer that at the state level with the National Park Service standards, the Secretary of Interior standards. Long name, but it is our Bible, the standards of what we live by, what defines a historic preservation neighborhood, what makes a place important, why is that archaeological site. These are the standards that have been adopted nationally, and they are applied by the HB Commission to cases like this. And we get to a very important part of those standards that deals with integrity. Is there enough historical integrity for a building to be listed on the National Register? Is there enough integrity to be eligible for the 40% tax credits that we have right now? Integrity is critical. It can support you by putting something on the National Register. Loss of integrity can lead to delisting from the National Register, of being delisted as a historic preservation district. So those are the standards. Now let's apply it to this particular case, the history of Heritage Hills. Many people think that Heritage Hills is a historic district because the rich and famous lived there and built their grand mansions in 1904, 1906, 1908. It's not. By doing my history, and it's a 250-page book, still being circulated, the reason this neighborhood is so significant is that it represents a time period in Oklahoma City history from 1902 to 1920, to the mid-1920s, because there are 4 or 5 different architectural styles of buildings within this contiguous neighborhood. It goes all the way from the grand mansions like Henry Overholser built in 1904. That would have been towards the top. It would have been down to the bungalow that I restored at 122 Northwest 22nd Street. That was built by G.A. Nichols in March, took out the building permit in March of 1919. Building permit was $5,000. And so you have this range of architectural styles from the Victorian and the Gothic-inspired buildings of the 19th century to the Colonial Revival to the bungalow and back to the European-styled homes that you see in the Harndale part of the neighborhood in the far west. This is unusual nationally. This is a very significant neighborhood because of the range of those 4 styles. And then when you talk about loss of integrity, the reason we have Heritage Hills and the reason Oklahoma City was among the ranks of Savannah and New Orleans in adopting a historic preservation ordinance in 1969 in a community that often looks at zoning as communism. One reason we have it so early is that it was loss of integrity. In 1950, an insurance company that bought one of the grand homes on the south side said, "We will preserve it for all time." Tore it down. St. Luke's needed to move out of its downtown location on Robinson, moved in, the neighbors started tearing down neighborhoods on one critical corner. Buildings or businesses started moving into the neighborhood. I've tracked this decade by decade in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
businesses moving into 16th and 17th, losing that historical integrity, people subdividing homes for boarding houses. Finally, that neighborhood, the leaders in that neighborhood in the 1960s said, no more. They pooled their resources together, say, we have something special here. It is special because of the materials, because of the scale of the homes, the style, what it represents about our history. And they were successful in creating HPI in 1967. The ordinance was passed by the council in 69, and it has survived all of these years. It's been under assault, believe me. As a preservationist, I've been on there on the front lines on those battles. But we have to remember that we have to maintain standards, historical integrity. Anytime we lose one building, even a bungalow, or one of the grand mansions, it affects the integrity of the entire district. It starts changing the style of buildings, the scale, the fabric, and we start losing the significance of preservation neighborhoods. The house that I bought for $11,000 now appraises over $200,000. Preservation works. Property values in that neighborhood are some of the highest in the entire city. Why? Because of historic preservation, because of the standards, because we have an HP ordinance that's willing to stand up and say this goes against the grain of public policy, that we will have historic preservation neighborhoods and we will maintain those standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That concludes our presentation, Mr. Chairman. I just want to acknowledge there are a number of residents here from the Heritage Hills and Heritage Hills East neighborhoods, and I won't introduce all of them, but I just would ask them to raise their hands just to let you all know as a board that they're here and interested in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Box, do you have a rebuttal?
Briefly. I'm also a Heritage Hills resident here and interested in this matter. I want to start at the chairman's question as it relates to imminent harm. So if you look at 59-1200.10, this is under the scope and jurisdiction section of the code, titled Interpretation, Purpose, and Conflict of this chapter. And A says, in interpreting and applying the provisions of this chapter, they shall be held to be the minimal requirements for the promotion of the public health, safety, comfort, convenience, order, and general welfare. What we believe is that the structure's inability to meet the various code standards, as evidenced by the city putting that notation on my client's door that they were in violation of multiple code provisions, tells us that the structure is an imminent threat to the public health, safety, and welfare. In talking to Mr. Johnson, and I'm happy to have him back up here, I asked him, what does that really mean to you? To your point, how is the public really threatened? If you think about this neighborhood, it's a very active neighborhood. There's lots of kids, Halloween, think of Halloween. If somebody were to walk to the porch, Mr. Johnson, although bigger than a child, when he first stepped on the porch, the board that he stepped on snapped in half. So perhaps the next person that steps on is the one board that means the whole house falls down. That's what we believe it means to be an imminent threat to the public harm. Otherwise, I guess you could put up a big fence around it to keep the public out. That would violate the ordinance. So having it open and available to public interaction, I believe, tells us that it's an imminent threat when the structural analysis tells us that it's in such state of disrepair. So I want to just touch on a few things. What Mr. Carey said, and it was the way that the motion was worded at the HP Commission, that the testimony provides the evidence that the house can be saved. The only evidence was Mr. Carey standing here saying, I've seen it, I can do it. I have no idea about the condition of the other houses. It's not relevant to your consideration. Here we have 3 separate licensed engineers who have put their professional seal and stamp on the line to say that it meets the standards in the ordinance. We're not contesting the importance of historic preservation and what it's meant for this neighborhood and this city. However, the fact that the ordinance, the HP ordinance, allows for the demolition tells us there's got to be some cases in which demolition is appropriate. So to say that we just never demolish anything runs completely contrary to the way that the ordinance is set up. So let's think about what you are to consider. the very outset of this, there was a motion made as to what could be considered. All of the things that Mr. Work has presented through his evidence and his experts are things that are now in the record. However, the motion you made makes clear you are not to consider it. So the only evidence to consider are 3 structural engineers, all of which have reports that are in the record for your consideration that all come to the same conclusion, that we do meet the provision of the ordinance, that the only way to eliminate the threat to the public harm is by demolition. And that is why the Historic Preservation staff recommended approval of the demolition. So we ask that you reverse the decision of the HP Commission and grant the CA for this structure.
Members, any questions? Okay. I don't have anyone else signed up to speak on this matter, but is anyone else here to speak on this matter? Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Brent Wall. I live at 126 Northwest 18th Street. I'm a 20-year resident of Heritage Hills East. I'll make some very brief statements. I think this block in particular, Northwest 20th, it's really important to look at what has happened to this particular block. If you look at it, you already have 2 vacant lots where structures have been torn down. Tearing down another one would be really a tragedy for this particular block. The character of that block is already going to be altered. Another demolition on this block I think would be extremely detrimental. I'm not going to speak to the structural or the environmental. I'm speaking as a neighbor and a resident who has spent 20 years in this neighborhood trying to make it better, and we just want to try to fight and protect this one structure as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. I assume you're going to want us to exclude the...
Well, no, I failed to convey something to the board that my client wished for me to convey, and she had conveyed this to HP. She is willing to commit to build an exact replica. We've heard a lot of talk about character. She's willing to build an exact replica of the house that was there. So in my mind, I think that's the best of both worlds. So I just wanted that to be a part of the record. But yes, I'd ask that you not consider on it.
I'll give kind of my comments and then welcome other comments of the board. But I think there are a lot of documents, a lot of issues that were considered below, but I think we can narrow the issues down based on what's before us and what's been conceded is not in dispute. That's first. There's no dispute about whether it contributes or not to historic integrity, so we don't have to decide that. Even though that, I think, was a finding of the HP Commission, I think, for our purposes, that's not in dispute. The other 2 factors, as I've already discussed, subsection C and D are not at issue before us, and the issue before us that's left, by my estimation, is subsection B, which is as evaluated by the Commission and now before us, based upon information including but not limited to reports, photographs, or inspections as a part of the site visit. The structure is in a state of decay or ruin and poses an imminent threat to public health or safety, and the demolition of said structure is required to alleviate said threat. So I think that's kind of the scope of our review, at least that's my position. I'm only one member of the board. Different things appeal to different people, but that's my scope of review. I still don't see how this meets the criteria of an imminent threat, given that it's been in this condition for some time. I have trouble interpreting what the code means by public health and public safety. I think there's an argument to be made that that means not localized to one property, but it affects the public in general. But I think there's also an argument to be made that maybe that is the purpose of different city boards and commissions, is to care about particular properties, and that's what they mean by public. So I struggle with that, but given that struggle, I don't know that I can override the decision of the HP Commission that they found that this was not an imminent threat to public safety or health. I think I've been to the property, and it's got a lot of problems, we'll put it that way, and it doesn't surprise me to hear that walking on the porch has issues. I just don't think that, for our purposes, we can take into consideration someone who might trespass on a property or enter into a property. It's dangerous for that person, or it's dangerous for the homeowner. I don't know. I'm not certain that that's the scope. It might be. I could be wrong. But I'm not confident enough that that's the scope to overturn the decision of HP Commission. And I also don't think that there's enough evidence to establish, even if we did establish the prior two conditions that we were just talking about, that demolition is required to alleviate the said threat. I think there are other things that could alleviate the threat, even if we presuppose a threat. And so for those reasons, as I first got this application, I was thinking we might modify HP Commission's decision, remand, reverse. I don't even think we need to do that. I think we can affirm on the two issues that are before us. One, whether it's a contributing structure to the historic integrity, which is not a dispute, and two, whether it's an imminent threat to public safety or health. I think we can just affirm on those two bases alone. But I'm only one member of the board, so welcome.
City Attorney's Office weigh in on, what you're really talking about is broad legal principles as to what is the public, right? Is it localized to this, or does it literally mean, if it literally means the entire city, I don't know that there's ever a demolition that could ever meet that standard. But I'd be curious to know what City Attorney's Office thinks on that.
Yeah, one comment before we get the city's not binding, but the city's opinion on an issue kind of off the cuff. Even if we met that issue, I'm not sure that we meet the other issue that demolition is required. So I'll get that out there. But if municipal council would like to opine.
So I don't have the exact statute in front of me, but there is a specific state statute that talks about dilapidated structures and when they may be torn down by a municipality because they pose public health, safety, welfare. And that's typically when there are large gaping holes in roofs and they're in the process really of falling down. So I don't, without the specific statute in front of me, I can't say exactly what that is, but there are statutes that clarify that.
Yeah, and the reason I'm not I don't know that it's necessarily required that we get to the bottom of that issue is because that wasn't particularly debated below. It wasn't litigated below. There wasn't briefing on that issue. And so based on what we have before us, I think we're bound by that. And given that, I don't know that I'm comfortable saying that this is an imminent threat to public safety. But even if it were, I'm not convinced that demolition is the only way around that. So that's where I stand, but I welcome other comments from board members.
I struggled with this both times. I read every bit of it. And I appreciate both the attorneys and everybody that's taken a moment or quite a bit of their time to come here and share with us their findings and their recommendations. And I still have some difficulty with this, but I can meet the ordinance. So my motion is to sustain the appeal, reverse the decision of the HP Commission based on hazard to public health, safety, and demolitions required. So that's my motion.
Did you want to put comments, or you can second if you like? But
I'll second.
Okay. A motion and a second to affirm the appeal in case number 14645 and reverse the decision of the HP Commission. Is that on both bases? Yeah. All the findings of fact?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And grant the certificate of appropriateness.
Okay.
To demolish.
Cast your votes, please.
Just get continued to,
With a 2-1
Can we call?
There is a continuance.
Okay.
And then we'll get a full board at the next meeting. I don't know that anyone's going to be absent at the next meeting, but we'll get a full board. So.
Well, we'll do it again.
Fortunately, I think we can, by agreement, incorporate the comments from this proceeding into that one. And so we don't need to have the whole thing
I'm
over
fine
again.
doing that. I mean, the only concern I have is we have one person that's heard zero of the argument. And while I don't want to, spend another 3 or 4 hours, my client certainly doesn't want to pay me to do that. I don't want to shortchange my client's position and assume that this member has read, or maybe perhaps as your colleagues, you could encourage them to watch the hearing.
They can't communicate about this.
Maybe the city attorney can ask them, just to avoid another 3 hours when I think everybody is entrenched in their positions. So it's a matter of what the other two say.
Yeah, I understand. And if I know the other two board members, which I'm certainly getting to know them, they'll watch every minute of it and read every document. So.
Thank you.
For the people that are interested, that this matters continue to the January 2nd meeting.
The day after New Year, I mean, all three of you plan to be here, I guess? Okay.
You got too many kids.
Although after sitting through this, knowing it'll be back on, maybe not.
We'll advise the relevant parties if we're at issue with a quorum or something.
Fine, but yeah, if you catch wind, JJ or Laura, that there's going to be people absent, there's no point in doing it. Thank you for your time.
The additional cases are either continued or withdrawn. Any additional items? Communications and board reports? I don't think so. Citizens to be heard? Seeing none or no other business, we are adjourned.